What's the worst speech you've ever heard at a wedding? Story 1. The wedding of Alex and Jess was perfect. Beautiful garden, elegant tables, twinkling lights. But one thing stood out above all: the best man speech. When Mike, Alex's longtime friend, took the microphone, everyone expected heartfelt words or at least a few lighthearted jokes. Instead, the first thing he said was, "Well, looks like Alex the ladies' man is finally off the market." The room tensed. Jess let out a nervous laugh. Alex's face turned pale. But Mike, oblivious to the awkwardness, kept going. "I've known Alex since our wild college days. Let's just say, commitment wasn't exactly his thing. Girls came and went like seasons. But Jess, you did the impossible. You tamed him." A few guests exchanged glances. Alex's mother took a large sip of wine. But Mike wasn't finished. "Oh, and remember that night in Vegas when you—" "All right, that's enough, Mike," Alex cut in sharply, grabbing the microphone. Silence. The discomfort in the air was almost visible. Even the champagne glasses seemed to tremble with secondhand embarrassment. But the worst part was yet to come. Mike, taking the microphone back, tried to fix things. "I'm just messing around. Alex is a changed man now. Well, at least since he met Jess. Or at least since that fight when she smashed his phone." Another long pause. Then Jess stood up, smiling sweetly. "Thanks, Mike. You just perfectly demonstrated why you weren't the best man." Laughter erupted. Mike chuckled awkwardly and finally sat down. It was a disaster. But for years to come, people would still talk about that speech as a perfect example of what not to do at a wedding. Story 2. The reception was going smoothly, candles flickering, guests laughing, the dance floor buzzing with excitement. Then came the speeches. The father of the bride gave a heartwarming toast. The maid of honor shared an emotional story. And then it was time for the groom's brother, Ethan. Ethan, notorious for his lack of filter, grabbed the mic with a confident grin. "Well, well, well. Who would have thought my little brother would be the first one in our family to get married?" He laughed. "I mean, if you asked anyone in high school, they would have bet against it." The crowd chuckled politely. The groom, Daniel, forced a smile. Ethan continued. "But honestly, seeing Dan settle down is a miracle. This is the same guy who once got dumped 3 times in 1 week." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The bride, Lily, blinked in shock. Daniel shook his head, silently pleading for Ethan to stop. "Oh, and let's not forget his terrible taste in women before he met Lily. Yikes!" A few awkward laughs. A cough. Someone's fork scraped too loudly against a plate. "Anyway," Ethan went on, oblivious. "Lily, you've really changed him. He showers regularly now, keeps his apartment— the bar was low, but still, impressive." Daniel buried his face in his hands. But Ethan wasn't done. "Now let's talk about the bachelor party. Oh man, if only you guys knew what happened in Vegas." "Ethan," Daniel interrupted sharp. "Wrap it up." Ethan blinked. Right, he cleared his throat. "Well, cheers to my brother and his amazing wife. Wishing you guys love, happiness, and, fewer awkward speeches in the future." Silence. Then Lily smiled, raised her glass and said, "And wishing Ethan a one-way ticket far away from the next family event." The entire room erupted with laughter. Ethan sat down, looking satisfied, completely unaware that his speech would go down in history as the worst wedding toast ever. Story 3. The wedding was magical. Soft golden lights, flowers cascading from the ceiling, a live jazz band playing in the background. Everything was flawless, until the speeches started. The bride's uncle, Tom, was not originally supposed to give a toast, but after a few too many glasses of wine, he insisted. All right, give me the mic," he said, standing up unsteadily. The best man hesitated but handed it over, probably assuming Tom would say something short and sweet. "Big mistake." Tom cleared his throat dramatically. "Marriage, a beautiful thing. Or so I've heard. Never worked out for me, personally. 3 ex-wives later, I can confidently say that love is unpredictable." A nervous chuckle passed through the crowd. The bride, Emily, widened her eyes in alarm. The groom, Mark, squeezed her hand under the table. "But you two," Tom pointed at them, swaying slightly, "you give me hope. Even though, let's be real, all marriages have secrets." He gave a dramatic pause. "Right, Mark." The room went dead silent. Mark looked like he had just been hit by a truck. Emily's grip on her champagne glass tightened. Tom, blissfully unaware of the tension, laughed. "Oh, don't look at me like that. I'm just saying, every man has something he hasn't told his wife yet. Maybe a little habit. Maybe an ex that still texts him. Maybe—" He wiggled his eyebrows. "A wild Vegas trip with the boys?" A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Mark sat up straight. I have no idea what you're talking about." Tom waved his hand dismissively. "Relax, kid. I'm sure it's nothing serious. I mean, I never told my second wife about the time I—" Tom, Emily's father cut in sharply. That's enough. Tom frowned, looking around the suddenly stiff crowd. He blinked, then raised his glass. Well, cheers to the happy couple. No one responded. The jazz band awkwardly started playing again. Tom took a long sip of his wine and finally sat down. Later that night, as the guests whispered about the speech, someone asked Emily how she felt about it. She smiled sweetly and said, well, at least now we know who won't be invited to our anniversary party. Story 5. The wedding reception was in full swing. Glasses clinking, guests laughing, the scent of fresh roses filling the air. Everything was picture perfect. Then came the speeches. The best man, Jake, took the mic. He was known for being a bit of a jokester, so people expected a few harmless laughs. What they didn't expect was disaster. Jake grinned. Wow, can't believe my boy Ryan actually got married. If you had told me this a few years ago, I would have bet good money against it. A few chuckles. Ryan, the groom, shifted uncomfortably. His bride, Sophie, raised an eyebrow. But seriously, man, Jake continued, it's impressive how far you've come. I remember when you were still texting other girls while you and Sophie were figuring things out. Silence. Someone coughed. Sophie's smile froze. Ryan's eyes widened in horror. Jake, completely oblivious, kept going. But don't worry, Sophie. That was way before you guys made it official. He winked. Well, mostly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sophie put down her champagne glass. Hard. Ryan's mom looked mortified. The maid of honor whispered something to her neighbor. Jake finally noticed the tension. Oh, come on! It's not like Ryan was the worst boyfriend. I mean, he changed. He had to. After that one time you almost broke up. Ryan shot up from his seat. Dude, that's enough. Jake blinked. Wait, was I not supposed to say that? Sophie crossed her arms. No, Jake. You were not. A long, painful pause. Jake let out a nervous chuckle. Well, marriage is about forgiveness, right? Dead silence. Then Sophie stood up, took the microphone, and with a perfectly calm smile said, Thank you, Jake. That was very eye-opening. Ryan sank lower in his chair. Jake, now sweating, cleared his throat. Anyway, cheers to the happy couple. He awkwardly lifted his glass. No one joined him. Later that night, as guests whispered about the speech, someone asked Sophie if she was okay. She smiled sweetly and said, Oh, I'm fine. But Ryan, he has a lot of explaining to do. Story 6. The reception hall was buzzing with excitement. The cake had been cut, the champagne was flowing, and now it was time for the speeches. The maid of honor gave a sweet, tearful toast. The groom's father shared a heartfelt blessing. And then it was time for the groom's childhood friend, Kevin. Kevin wasn't officially part of the wedding party, but after a few drinks, he convinced himself that he needed to say something. Big mistake. He grabbed the mic with a huge grin. All right, listen up. I just have to share a few things about my boy, Matt. Matt, the groom, immediately tensed. His bride, Olivia, gave him a questioning look. Kevin laughed. So I've known Matt since middle school, and let me tell you, this guy was not always husband material. A few chuckles. Matt forced a smile. Olivia's mother raised an eyebrow. Oh man, Kevin continued. There was a time when Matt swore he'd never get married. Said it was a scam. The guests, Olivia blinked. Kevin, completely oblivious, kept talking. Yeah, he used to say marriage was just a fancy way to ruin a good thing. He took a swig of his drink. Crazy how things change, huh? Matt's jaw clenched. Olivia set her champagne glass down a little too hard. But hey, Olivia, you must be special because before you, this guy had a type, Kevin air quoted dramatically. And let's just say, you're way out of his usual league. Laughter. Some nervous, some genuine. Kevin smirked. No, for real. If you saw some of his exes, you'd be shocked. Matt rubbed his temples. Olivia's father shifted uncomfortably. Olivia just stared at Kevin, unblinking. But Kevin wasn't done. And let's not forget the time Matt got dumped in the middle of a Denny's. Funniest thing I've ever seen. A horrified gasp from someone's grandmother. Dude, Matt stood up. Stop talking. Kevin froze, blinking. Wait, was that too much? Matt exhaled sharp. Olivia grabbed the microphone from Kevin's hand and, with an icy smile, said, Thank you, Kevin. That was educational. The guests erupted into laughter. Kevin, now realizing his mistake, slumped back into his chair, mumbling, I thought it was funny. As the night went on, people whispered about the speech. Someone later asked Olivia if she was upset. She just smiled sweetly and said, Oh, not at all. But Matt? He'll be sleeping on the couch for a while. Story 7. The wedding had been nothing short of magical. The ceremony was beautiful, the food was exquisite, and the atmosphere was filled with love. Everything was going perfect. Then came the speeches. The best man, Dylan, took the microphone. He was the groom's childhood friend, and everyone expected some lighthearted jokes and a heartfelt toast. Instead, what they got was chaos. Dylan smirked. Wow, can't believe my boy Adam actually locked it down. I mean, this guy, the same Adam who once said, and I quote, "Marriage is just an expensive way to say I give up." The room fell silent. Adam, the groom, suddenly sat up straighter. His bride, Natalie, slowly turned to look at him. A few nervous laughs. Dylan chuckled, oblivious. "But hey, Natalie, don't worry," he pointed at her. "You must be the exception, right?" Natalie's smile tightened. Adam cleared his throat. Dylan grinned. "Oh, but let's talk about how they met." Fun fact, Adam was actually dating someone else when he first met Natalie. Gasps. Adam's face turned pale. Natalie arched an eyebrow. "Oh, don't look so shocked," Dylan laughed. It wasn't serious. I mean, sure, he technically had a girlfriend, but once he met Natalie, that relationship was doomed. He spent weeks talking about how he wasn't sure what to do. More gasps. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Adam's mother covered her face with her hands. Adam sat frozen. Natalie swirled her wine glass, watching him carefully. Dylan, still not catching the hint, grinned wider. "But hey, it all worked out, right? She's the one." Even though, Dylan snorted, there was that time he almost backed out of the proposal because he had a mini panic attack about spending forever with one person. Silence. Adam's mouth fell open. Natalie inhaled slowly. Dylan glanced around. Wait, was I not supposed to say that? Natalie calmly placed her napkin on the table and stood up. She took the microphone from Dylan's hand, smiled sweetly, and said, "Thank you, Dylan." That was illuminating. Then she turned to Adam and added, "We'll talk later." The entire room erupted in nervous laughter. Adam looked like he wanted to disappear. Dylan, realizing his mistake way too late, awkwardly raised his glass. Well, cheers? No one joined him. Later that night, someone asked Natalie if she was upset. She just smiled and said, "Not at all." But Adam? He's got a lot of explaining to do. Story 8. The wedding was picture perfect. The fairy lights twinkled, soft music played, and the guests were having a fantastic time. Everything was running smoothly. And then it was time for the speeches. The maid of honor, Sarah, took the microphone with a beaming smile. She was the bride's childhood best friend, and everyone expected a heartwarming speech with a few fun stories. What they got instead was a disaster in real time. Sarah sighed dramatic. "Wow, I still can't believe Emily is married. Like seriously, if you had told me 5 years ago that she'd be standing here in a white dress, I would have laughed in your face." Some chuckles. Emily, the bride, forced a smile. Her husband, Jake, glanced at her warily. Sarah continued, completely oblivious. Not because she's not amazing, of course. It's just that, well, she wasn't exactly the forever type. The room shifted. Emily's mother blinked. Jake's parents exchanged looks. Sarah giggled. "I mean, you guys have no idea how many times Emily swore she'd never get married." She made air quotes. She literally said, and I quote, "Marriage is just settling with someone you tolerate." Jake's smile faltered. Emily looked down at her drink. "Oh, and let's not forget all the times she said she'd just get a dog instead of a husband." Sarah cackled. "So, Jake, congrats. You barely beat out a golden retriever." Silence. Sarah still didn't notice. And honestly, I thought she was serious. "I mean, remember Tom?" She turned to Emily's eyes widened in horror. "Sarah," but it was too late. Sarah smirked. "Oh, come on. You all remember Tom, right? That guy Emily was convinced was the one? She was obsessed. And then, poof, he ghosted her." The guests gasped. Jake's face darkened. Sarah laughed. "Oh man, she was heartbroken. I seriously thought she'd never recover. But then she met Jake, and I guess he was the next best option." Emily's hand tightened around her champagne glass. Jake cleared his throat. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Emily stood up, walked over to Sarah, and calmly took the microphone. She smiled sweetly and said, "Thank you, Sarah. That was certainly something." Then, without missing a beat, she turned to Jake and said, "For the record, honey, I did get a golden retriever. His name is you." Laughter erupted. Sarah, now realizing her mistake, awkwardly sat down. Later that night, someone asked Emily if she was mad. She just grinned and said, "Oh, not at all." But Sarah? She definitely won't be making a speech at our anniversary party. Story 9. The wedding had been perfect so far. The vows were beautiful, the food was incredible, and everyone was having an amazing time. Then came the speeches. The groom's cousin, Nick, was not originally on the list to speak, but after a few drinks, he insisted on grabbing the mic. Huge mistake. He stood up, swaying slightly and grinned. "All right, listen up, everyone. I have to tell you all something about my cousin, Ben." Ben, the groom, tensed. His new wife, Rachel, gave him a questioning look. Nick chuckled. You see, Ben here has always been a little unlucky with women. Like, really unlucky. A few nervous chuckles. Ben rubbed his temples. Rachel sipped her wine. Nick continued, oblivious. No, seriously, this guy has been dumped more times than I can count. One time, a girl literally left him in the middle of a movie theater. No explanation. Just disappeared. Another one? She dumped him over text while he was waiting for her at a fancy restaurant. Gasps. Ben turned bright red. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. But hey, Nick raised his glass. Clearly that streak is over. Finally! The laughter was tense. Rachel put down her glass and smiled. Too sweet. Wow, Nick! I had no idea Ben had so much experience getting dumped. Ben coughed. Babe, he's just joking. But Nick wasn't done. Oh, and let's not forget the time Ben almost didn't propose. The entire room went dead silent. Rachel's head snapped toward Ben. I'm sorry. What? Nick, grinning like an idiot, waved his hand. Oh, don't worry, don't worry. He was going to do it. Eventually, he laughed. He just freaked out a little. I mean, commitment is scary, right? More silence. Nick took another sip of his drink. Honestly, I was sure he'd back out. But hey, here we are. Rachel exhaled sharply and turned to Ben. Did you almost back out? Ben shot Nick a murderous look. Nick? Shut up. Nick blinked. Wait, did I say too much? Rachel grabbed the microphone from his hand. She smiled at him and said, Nick, that was informative. Then she turned to the guests, raised her glass and said, to my very confident husband who obviously never had doubts about marrying me. Laughter erupted. Ben groaned. Nick awkwardly slid back into his chair. Later that night, someone asked Rachel if she was upset. She just grinned and said, not at all. But Nick? He's definitely not invited to the baby shower. Story 10. The wedding reception was flawless. Soft music, candlelit tables, guests clinking glasses in celebration. Everything felt magical until the speeches started. The best man, Tyler, was the groom's oldest friend. He was charming, funny, and a little too confident with a microphone in his hand. Big mistake. Tyler grinned. Wow, I never thought I'd see this day. Not because I didn't believe in love, but because Ethan, he pointed at the groom, was probably the least likely person to settle down. A few chuckles. Ethan tensed. His new wife, Lily, raised an eyebrow. Tyler continued, completely unaware of the storm brewing. No, really, guys. If you knew Ethan in college, you'd understand. This man was a legend. Not for his charm, not for his good looks, but for his absolute fear of commitment. Silence. Ethan let out a forced laugh. Lily just sipped her wine. Tyler grinned wider. I mean, let's be honest. He wasn't exactly a one-woman kind of guy. Right, Ethan? Someone coughed. Ethan's mother pressed her lips together. Lily's father narrowed his eyes. Tyler, oblivious, kept going. Oh, and remember that time you accidentally double-booked 2 dates on the same night? Classic. Lily turned her head slowly. Ethan gulped. And let's not even talk about the time you ghosted that one girl because, what was it again? Relationships are just too much work? A fork clattered onto a plate. The room was dead silent. Tyler finally noticed the tension. He chuckled nervously. I mean, obviously that was before Lily. Lily set down her champagne glass. Oh? So, at what point did Ethan suddenly become husband material? Tyler stammered. Well, you know, once he met you? Lily smiled too sweetly. Ah, so I was just a rehabilitation project? Tyler's face paled. Ethan shook his head furiously. No, not at all. Tyler tried to backtrack. I mean, he loves you. Obviously, you changed him, you know? Like, tamed him. Lily's smile disappeared. Tamed? More silence. Tyler laughed awkwardly. Cheers to the happy couple. Nobody raised their glass. Lily took a deep breath and stood up. She took the microphone, looked at Tyler and said, Thank you, Tyler. That was very insightful. Then she turned to Ethan and added, We'll talk later. The guests burst into laughter. Ethan buried his face in his hands. Tyler sat down very quickly. Later that night, someone asked Lily if she was upset. She just smiled and said, Not at all. But Tyler? He just lost his wedding invite. For life. Story 11. Everyone was having a fantastic time at the wedding. The food was incredible, the drinks were flowing, and the dance floor was packed. It was the kind of night people would talk about for years. And then the speeches started. The maid of honor, Claire, took the mic. She was the bride's best friend since college, and people expected a touching, heartfelt toast. What they got was a complete disaster. Claire giggled as she tapped the mic. Wow, okay, so first of all, let's just take a moment to acknowledge that Mia is married. Like, actually married. Who saw that coming? Because I sure didn't. Mia, the bride, stiffened. Her new husband, Josh, glanced at her with a confused smile. Claire waved a hand. No, don't get me wrong. It's just that Mia always said she wasn't the marriage type. I mean, we all remember that phase when she swore she'd never belong to just one man, right? Gasps. Mia's grandmother nearly choked on her champagne. Josh raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Claire kept going. I mean, she was so sure. We used to joke that she'd run off to Europe and have a different boyfriend in every city, Claire snorted. And honestly, I thought she would. The tension in the room was suffocating. Mia's mom closed her eyes. Josh's dad shook his head. Mia, meanwhile, looked like she was mentally plotting Claire's immediate removal from her life. But Claire, completely oblivious, wasn't done. Oh, and let's not forget all the times she almost didn't go through with this wedding. Mia's jaw clenched. Claire laughed. No, I mean, remember when she was freaking out, saying maybe she wasn't ready for a husband yet? That was like 2 months ago. Dead silence. Josh's face went blank. Mia's grip on her wine glass tightened. Claire finally sensed something was wrong. Oh, that was supposed to be a joke? Mia exhaled slowly, stood up, and walked over to Claire. Taking the microphone, she smiled sweetly and said, Claire, that was very interesting. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I need to go explain to my husband that I do want to be married. Laughter erupted. Josh chuckled, shaking his head. Claire, realizing way too late what she had done, awkwardly sat down. Later that night, someone asked Mia if she was mad. She sipped her champagne and said, Not mad. But Claire? Yeah, she's off the bridesmaid group chat. Story 12. The evening had been perfect so far. The ceremony was beautiful, the food was amazing, and the dance floor was filling up fast. Everyone was in high spirits, celebrating the love between the newlyweds. Then came the speeches. The groom's older brother, Ryan, took the mic. He was known for his sense of humor, so people expected a fun, light-hearted toast. They were not prepared for what happened next. Ryan grinned. Wow, my little brother, Jake, is married. Honestly, I never thought I'd see the day. Not because he's not a great guy, but because, well, let's just say commitment was never his strong suit. The room chuckled. Jake forced a smile. His bride, Anna, glanced at him with mild curiosity. Ryan continued. I mean, growing up, this guy couldn't even commit to a favorite cereal. One day it was Frosted Flakes. The next it was Lucky Charms. And don't even get me started on his dating history. Jake's smile froze. Anna's expression turned from amused to concerned. Ryan smirked. Oh yeah, before he met Anna, Jake had this little thing I like to call serial short-term syndrome. 3-month relationships max. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jake's mom closed her eyes. Anna's father visibly tensed. Ryan, still completely unaware of the impending doom, laughed. And the breakups? Man, this guy had a system. He'd suddenly get too busy with work, or need time to figure himself out. Anna blinked. Slowly, Jake cleared his throat. Ryan, maybe? But Ryan was on a roll. Oh, and let's not forget the infamous time he texted me. Dude, I think I might be done with dating forever. Silence. Jake exhaled sharp. Anna folded her arms. Ryan chuckled. But hey, I guess he changed his mind when he met Anna. Either that or she just didn't let him escape. More silence. A bead of sweat formed on Jake's forehead. Anna picked up her champagne glass, sipped slowly, then set it down. She turned to Jake and asked, So, you had a system? Ryan finally realized what he had done. That was all in the past? Anna smiled. The kind of smile that made every man in the room feel sorry for Jake. Then she stood up, took the mic from Ryan and said, Thank you, Ryan. That was a fascinating insight into my husband's past. She turned to Jake. We'll definitely be having a conversation later. The guests burst into laughter. Jake sighed. Ryan sank into his chair. Later that night, someone asked Anna if she was upset. She just smirked and said, Not upset, just extremely curious about some things. Story 13. The reception was in full swing. Glasses clinked, the dance floor was packed, and the energy was high. The newlyweds, Olivia and David, looked like the happiest people in the world. And then it was time for the speeches. David's best friend, Eric, grabbed the microphone. He had been there for every stage of David's life, so people expected a funny yet heartfelt toast. What they got was absolute chaos. Eric smirked. Wow, David is a married man. Honestly, if you had asked me a few years ago if this guy would ever settle down, I would have laughed in your face. David tensed. Olivia's smile remained, but her eyes narrowed. Eric continued, completely unaware. No, really, I mean, David was the guy who swore he'd never get tied down. Like, the #1 anti-marriage spokesperson. I distinctly remember him saying, marriage is just a legal way to make breakups more expensive. A collective gasp. David turned pale. Olivia slowly set down her champagne glass. Eric laughed. Oh, and don't get me started on his infamous 3-month rule. David shot him a look of pure panic. Eric. Stop! But Eric, not reading the room at all, grinned. Oh, should I explain? The 3-month rule was David's golden. Never date anyone longer than 3 months because that's when things get too serious. More gasps. Olivia's mother let out a sharp David's father rubbed his temples. Eric chuckled. But hey, obviously Olivia changed all that. I mean, he actually made it past 3 months. I remember when he hit the 4-month mark and I asked, dude, is this a real relationship? And he said, David stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. Eric. Enough. Too late. Eric scratched his head. Wait, was I not supposed to say all that? Olivia exhaled slowly. Then, with the calmest smile, she stood up, took the mic from Eric's hand and said, Thank you, Eric. That was deeply insightful. She turned to David. So 3-month rule, huh? David let out a long, defeated sigh. The guests exploded with laughter. Eric sat down, realizing he had completely ruined his best friend's night. Later, someone asked Olivia if she was mad. She just grinned and said, No, but David, oh, he's gonna have to work hard to prove he's in this for the long run. Story 14. The night was absolutely perfect. Twinkling lights, glasses filled with champagne, and the newlyweds glowing with happiness. Guests were laughing, music played softly in the background, and everything felt magical. Then came the speeches. The maid of honor, Jessica, took the microphone. She had been the bride's best friend since high school, so everyone expected a heartfelt and touching toast. What they got was something entirely different. Jessica smiled brightly. Wow, I still can't believe Emma is married. Not because she doesn't deserve happiness, of course, but because, well, let's just say she really took her time getting here. Emma, the bride, froze. Her husband, Daniel, chuckled awkwardly. Jessica continued, completely unaware of the tension growing in the room. I mean, seriously, Emma was the queen of situationships. I can't even count how many times she called me crying about some guy who wasn't ready for a relationship. The guests murmured. Emma's mother shot her a look. Daniel suddenly looked very interested in his drink. Jessica giggled. Oh, and remember Mike? She turned to Emma. Emma's face drained of color. Jess, don't. But it was too late. Jessica laughed. Come on, you guys have to hear this. There was this guy, Mike, who Emma was so sure was the one. She was obsessed. She actually told me, and I quote, if I don't marry Mike, I'll just stay single forever. Dead silence. Daniel's smile disappeared. Emma's grip on her champagne flute tightened. Jessica still didn't realize what she had done. But look at her now. Turns out Mike wasn't the one after all. Nope, she found Daniel instead. Jessica winked. Or as I like to call him, Plan B. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Someone dropped a fork. Emma's grandmother visibly shook her head. Emma stood up instantly. She walked over to Jessica, took the microphone, and smiled way too sweetly. Thank you, Jessica. That was interesting. She turned to Daniel. And don't worry, honey, your plan A, B, and Z. Laughter erupted. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head, but Jessica's face turned bright red as she finally realized her mistake. Later that night, someone asked Emma if she was mad. She took a sip of her champagne and said, Not mad. But Jessica? Yeah, she's definitely losing her maid of honor privileges at the vow. Story 15. The reception was in full swing. Guests were dancing, champagne was flowing, and laughter filled the air. The bride and groom looked radiant, completely wrapped up in their happiness. And then, it was time for the speeches. The groom's cousin, Mark, was not originally scheduled to speak. But after a few drinks and a little too much confidence, he decided that he had something important to say. Big mistake. Mark grabbed the microphone, swaying slightly. All right. I just have to say something about my cousin, Jake. Jake, the groom, immediately tensed. His new wife, Sophie, smiled politely but glanced at Jake for reassurance. Mark chuckled. Man, I still can't believe Jake is married. I mean, no offense, but if you knew him a few years ago, you'd be just as shocked as I am. A few nervous laughs. Jake clenched his jaw. Sophie's smile froze. Mark waved a hand. No, really, guys. This man avoided relationships like they were the plague. You should have seen how fast he used to bolt whenever a girl started getting too attached. Silence. Sophie slowly put her wineglass down. Jake buried his face in his hands. Mark, oblivious, kept going. Oh, and let's not forget the time he swore he'd never be dumb enough to get married before 40. More silence. Sophie turned to Jake. I'm sorry, what? Jake gave Mark a look of pure murder. Mark, seriously. Stop! Mark laughed. Oh, and remember when you had that whole phase where you called marriage a trap? That was classic. Someone gasped. Sophie's father shifted in his seat. Jake's mom took a deep breath. Mark still wasn't done. But hey, clearly Sophie changed all that. Or I guess she was just stubborn enough to stick around until he finally gave in. Another gasp. Jake instantly stood up. Mark, sit down. Mark blinked. Oh, was that bad? Sophie, completely composed, stood up as well. She took the microphone from Mark's hand, smiled at the guests and said, "Thank you, Mark. That was enlightening." Then she turned to Jake, patted his shoulder and added, "We'll be discussing this later." The room exploded with laughter. Jake sighed, running a hand down his face while Mark finally slumped into his chair, realizing he had just made the worst wedding speech ever. Later that night, someone asked Sophie if she was upset. She just grinned and said, "Not upset." But Jake? Oh, he's definitely making up for that speech on our honeymoon. Story 16. The wedding had been a dream. Stunning venue, amazing food, and a dance floor packed with happy guests. Everything had gone perfectly. Until the speeches. The bride's older brother, Matt, took the microphone. He had always been the overprotective sibling, but everyone expected a sweet, sentimental toast. What they got was an absolute disaster. Matt smirked. "Wow, I honestly never thought I'd see the day. My little sister, Emily, actually found someone who could put up with her." The room tensed. Emily blinked. Her new husband, Ryan, gave a cautious chuckle. Matt continued, completely unaware of the tension. "No, seriously, growing up, Emily was a nightmare. I mean, just ask our parents. She was impossible. Stubborn, bossy, and terrible at admitting when she was wrong." Emily's smile froze. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Matt kept going. "And don't get me started on her dating history. Wow, some of the guys she's brought home? Let's just say, Ryan, you're a massive upgrade." More gasps. Emily's mother closed her eyes. Ryan's parents exchanged a look. Matt, oblivious, laughed. "Oh, and do you guys know how many times she almost didn't go through with this wedding? I mean, she called me like 4 times freaking out about whether she was really ready for this." Ryan turned to Emily. "Wait, what?" Emily inhaled sharply. "Matt." But Matt just grinned. "Dude, don't worry. She obviously went through with it. I mean, for now, dead." Silence. Matt finally sensed something was wrong. Too much?" Emily stood up, smiling sweetly, walked over, and took the microphone from Matt's hand. "Thank you, Matt," she said, her voice dangerously calm. She turned to Ryan. "Honey, just so you know, I was never having doubts about you. Just about whether I wanted my brother at the wedding." Laughter erupted. Matt sank into his chair, realizing he had just become the family embarrassment. Later, someone asked Emily if she was mad. She sipped her champagne and said, "Not mad. But next time, Matt's definitely not getting a microphone." Story 17. The wedding had been perfect. The vows were beautiful, the food was incredible, and the guests were having an amazing time. The bride and groom were glowing with happiness. And then came the speeches. The groom's best friend Jason took the microphone. Everyone expected a fun, heartfelt toast. What they got was an absolute disaster. Jason smirked. "Wow, I still can't believe Mike actually pulled this off. Not because he doesn't deserve happiness, but because, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly a one-woman kind of guy." The guests chuckled, some nervously. Mike, the groom, immediately tensed. His new wife, Lauren, raised an eyebrow. Jason continued, completely unaware of the tension growing in the room. "I mean, this is the same Mike who once told me, and I quote, 'Why settle for one flavor when you can try the whole menu?'" A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Lauren's smile vanished. Mike's mother's jaw dropped. Jason kept going. "Oh, and don't get me started on all the times he almost screwed this up." Jason laughed. "Lauren, do you know how many times this guy called me saying, 'Dude, I think I messed up. Do you think she's actually mad this time?'" More silence. Mike buried his face in his hands. Lauren tapped her fingers against her champagne glass, expression unreadable. Jason grinned. But hey, he must have done something right because somehow he convinced Lauren to marry him. Honestly, dude, I still don't know how you pulled it off. The room was dead quiet. Jason finally sensed something was off. Should I wrap it up?" Lauren stood up. She walked over, took the microphone from Jason and smiled sweetly. "Thank you, Jason. That was fascinating." She turned to Mike. "So, the whole menu, huh?" Mike groaned. "Babe, I was 20 when I said that." The guests erupted into laughter. Jason quickly sat down, finally realizing what he had done. Later, someone asked Lauren if she was upset. She just grinned and said, "Not at all." But Mike? Oh, he's definitely spending the honeymoon making this up to me. Story 18. The wedding had been magical. The ceremony was beautiful. The food was incredible. And the love between the bride and groom was undeniable. Then came the speeches. The bride's cousin, Rachel, took the microphone. She wasn't originally supposed to give a toast, but after a few glasses of champagne, she decided she had to say something. Big mistake. Rachel giggled as she tapped the mic. Wow, I still can't believe my cousin Claire is married. I mean, if you had told me a few years ago, I would have bet good money that she'd be single forever. The guests chuckled awkwardly. Claire's smile tightened. Her husband, Matt, gave her a very confused look. Rachel, completely oblivious, kept going. No, but seriously, Claire was not the relationship type. She hated commitment. She used to say marriage was just signing up for a lifetime of compromise and sharing food. Matt blinked. Wait, what? Claire shot Rachel a look, but Rachel just laughed. Oh, and let's not forget all the failed relationships before Matt. Claire, you remember Derek, right? A gasp rippled through the crowd. Claire's fingers curled around her wine glass. Matt looked very interested in this new piece of information. Rachel kept talking. Guys, Claire was obsessed with Derek. She swore he was the one. She actually told me, if I don't marry Derek, I'll just adopt 10 cats and give up on love. Silence. Matt slowly turned his head toward Claire. Derek, huh? Claire exhaled sharp. Rachel. Rachel finally noticed the tension. She let out a nervous laugh. Oh, but obviously, Matt was the real one. I mean, Derek who, right? More silence. Rachel panicked. Anyway, cheers to Claire and Matt. To forever. Claire stood up, walked over, and calmly took the microphone. She smiled sweetly at Rachel and said, Thank you, Rachel. That was unexpectedly informative. Then she turned to Matt and patted his hand. Don't worry, babe. You were always my first choice. Laughter erupted. Rachel sank into her chair, finally realizing what she had done. Later that night, someone asked Claire if she was mad. She just grinned and said, Not mad, but Rachel. Oh, she's getting uninvited from my birthday party. Story 19. The wedding had been perfect. From the heartfelt vows to the incredible food, everything was going exactly as planned. And then the speeches started. The groom's uncle, Gary, wasn't originally on the list to speak, but after a few drinks, he insisted he had some wisdom to share. Huge mistake. Gary took the microphone, swaying slightly. All right. I just have to say something about my nephew, and Andrew the groom sat up straight. His new wife, Sophie, smiled politely but gave him a questioning glance. Gary chuckled. I still can't believe this guy is married. I mean, this is the same Andrew who, just a few years ago, swore he would never settle down. Andrew tensed. Sophie's smile froze. Gary continued, completely unaware of the tension forming in the room. Oh yeah, he was all about the single life. Said marriage was a trap, and that he'd rather spend his money on cars and vacations than a wedding. A few nervous laughs. Sophie's dad visibly frowned. Andrew cleared his throat. Uncle Gary? But Gary kept going. And let's not forget all those times he said he wasn't husband material. Gary laughed. Sophie, you really must have worked some magic on. Silence. Sophie put down her champagne glass. Oh? Husband material? Andrew groaned. Babe, that was years ago. Gary still wasn't done. Oh, and speaking of that, I have to mention how Andrew used to have a very specific type. Andrew's face drained of color. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Oh? Do tell. Gary grinned. Let's just say, Sophie, you're not it. Gasps. Sophie's mother gasped so loudly people turned to look. Andrew immediately stood up. Okay, that's enough. Gary frowned. Wait, was that bad? Sophie slowly stood up, walked over and took the microphone from his hand. She smiled sweetly. Thank you, Gary. That was fascinating. She turned to Andrew. So, not your type, huh? Andrew sighed, running a hand down his face. You're exactly my type, babe. Laughter erupted. Gary finally sat down, realizing he had just ruined his chance of getting invited to any future family event. Later that night, someone asked Sophie if she was upset. She just smirked and said, Not at all. But Andrew? Oh, he's definitely making this up to me on our honeymoon. Story 20. The wedding had been magical. From the breathtaking venue to the emotional vows, it was the kind of night people would remember forever. And then came the speeches. The best man, Kevin, took the microphone. As the groom's childhood friend, everyone expected a funny yet touching toast. What they got was a disaster. Kevin grinned. Wow, I still can't believe Chris is married. I mean, this is the same guy who once told me, and I quote, marriage is just a fancy way to lose half your stuff. The room fell dead silent. Chris, the groom, froze. His new wife, Lily, turned her head slowly. Kevin chuckled, oblivious to the horror he had just unleashed. No, but really, it's crazy. Chris used to be terrified of commitment. You guys have no idea how many times he panicked over just dating someone for too long. Chris rubbed his temples. Lily took a long sip of her champagne. Kevin laughed. Oh, and remember when you said you'd never get engaged before 35? I mean, guess we can throw that plan out the window, huh? Chris visibly paled. Lily set her glass down very carefully. Kevin kept going. And let's not even talk about his escape plan. Chris shot up in his chair. Kevin, number... But Kevin smirked. Oh, come on, it's funny. Back in college, Chris had this whole strategy for ending things before they got too serious. He'd suddenly get super busy with work or start talking about not being ready for something real. Gasps. Lily arched an eyebrow. Kevin chuckled. But hey, clearly that didn't happen this time. So I guess Lily is the one who finally caught him, huh? Silence. Chris groaned. Dude, stop talking. Kevin blinked. Wait, was that bad? Lily slowly stood up, walked over, and took the microphone from Kevin's hand. She smiled sweetly and said, "Thank you, Kevin. That was eye-opening." Then she turned to Chris. So, escape plan, huh? Chris sighed, already accepting his fate. I love you, okay? The guests exploded with laughter. Kevin sank into his chair, finally realizing what he had done. Later that night, someone asked Lily if she was mad. She smirked and said, "Not mad." But Chris? Oh, he's definitely making up for that speech. Story 21. The wedding had been picture perfect. Stunning decorations, delicious food, and a dance floor packed with happy guests. The energy in the room was incredible, and everyone was celebrating the love between the newlyweds. And then, the speeches began. The bride's younger sister, Becca, took the microphone. She was known for her playful personality, so people expected some light teasing and a heartfelt message. What they got was absolute chaos. Becca grinned. Wow, I still can't believe my big sister is married. I mean, growing up, she was always the one who said she didn't need a man. Laughter. The bride, Rachel, chuckled, but it was a little too tight. Her husband, James, shot her a curious look. Becca continued, completely unaware of the warning signs. No, really, Rachel was so sure she was going to be a strong, independent woman forever. I think at one point she said, "If I ever get married, it'll be to my career." More laughter. James raised an eyebrow. Rachel reached for her wine glass. Becca giggled. And don't even get me started on how picky she used to be. Oh my God, the number of times she would go on a date and call me afterward like, "Nope, he chews weird." It's over. Gasps. James turned his head slowly. Rachel froze. Becca. But Becca kept going. Oh. And remember that one time she swore she'd rather move to another country than marry someone who wasn't the absolute perfect man? Silence. James took a sip of his drink. Huh. Interesting. Rachel exhaled sharp. Babe, Becca laughed. No, don't worry. Obviously, James, you made the cut. Eventually. James blinked. Eventually? Rachel buried her face in her hands. Becca, stop talking. Becca finally sensed something was wrong. Oh, should I just say cheers now? Rachel stood up. She took the microphone from Becca, smiled way too sweetly and said, "Thank you, Becca. That was incredibly unnecessary." Then she turned to James. "For the record, you were always the dream. I just had to wait until I found you." The guests erupted in applause. James smiled and kissed her hand. Becca sank into her chair, finally realizing she had just made the worst wedding speech of all time. Later that night, someone asked Rachel if she was mad. She smirked and said, "Not mad." But Becca? She's definitely losing her speech privileges at my future baby shower. Story 22. The wedding had been flawless. A breathtaking venue, an emotional ceremony, and guests who were genuinely happy to celebrate the love between the newlyweds. And then came the speeches. The groom's college roommate, Dan, took the microphone. He was supposed to give a short, simple toast. Instead, he gave the worst speech in wedding history. Dan grinned. Wow, I can't believe my buddy Liam is actually married. This is the same guy who once told me, and I quote, "I'm just not built for long-term relationships." Silence. Liam, the groom, froze. His new wife, Emma, turned her head very slowly. Dan laughed, completely unaware. No, seriously, this man was dedicated to the bachelor life. I mean, if commitment issues were an Olympic sport, he'd have at least 3 gold medals. Gasps. Emma's mother pressed her lips together. Liam's dad took a very deep sip of his whiskey. Dan kept going. Oh, and let's not forget how he almost didn't propose. Liam's eyes widened in horror. Dan, stop! Emma set her champagne glass down. Excuse me? Dan waved a hand. No, he wanted to. He just, panicked for a couple of months first. Dead. Silence. Emma folded her arms. A couple of months? Dan still didn't realize what he had done. Haha, yeah. I remember him pacing around our apartment saying, "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not ready?" Liam buried his face in his hands. Dan laughed. But hey, obviously he got over it. And now he's a changed man, I think. More silence. Dan scratched his head. Should I wrap this up? Emma stood up. She took the microphone from Dan's hand, smiled way too sweetly, and said, "Thank you, Dan. That was deeply insightful." Then she turned to Liam. "So, a couple of months, huh?" Liam sighed. "I love you, okay?" The guests exploded with laughter. Dan sank into his chair, finally realizing he was never getting invited to a wedding again. Later that night, someone asked Emma if she was upset. She smirked and said, "Not upset." But Liam? Oh, he's definitely spending the honeymoon making this up to me. Story 23.